Welcome to the live panel session, Optimizing Orchard Profitability, Factors to Consider. It has been a while, some 20 years, since almond growers have faced lower prices. Thus, we thought it would be useful to talk to some experts who've been around almonds and growing of almonds for a long time to focus on what to prioritize when money is tighter than expected. Note, this is a live session, not a pre-recorded one. We are daring to do it, so there may be some technical glitches along the way. Apologize in advance. And also realize that the way the format is, I will give each of the panelists a few minutes to give their perspective, then I will ask some questions. But in the meanwhile, if you audience members have questions, please use the question and answer button to ask your questions, and then I will go through them and ask them of the panel. So with that, I'll introduce the speakers today, or the panelists today. Most of them are probably quite familiar to many in the industry. I've been there for 10 years. He grew up with almonds in the Turlock area, continues to grow almonds himself, and is a graduate of Fresno State. And Mike Griffin is the regional manager for Blue Diamond in the Madera and Fresno region, or North Fresno region. He's been working with almond growers for 18 years, focusing on how do we improve growing and planting efforts. And he's a graduate both of UC Davis and of Santa Clara College. And last but certainly not least is Bill Brush. He's both a CCA and a PCA with his own consulting company called B&B Ag Consulting. He's been working with growers for over 30 years and is a graduate of UC Davis. And again, as a reminder, it's a live session, so please ask questions in the Q&A box, and I will moderate. And with that, I will turn to fronts, and the sequence will be fronts, Mike, Scott, Bill, for each of you to give some of your philosophy about what growers should think about as they're trying to assess or prioritize what to spend money on when money is tighter. So fronts.
Okay, thanks very much, Gabriel. The goal is consistent high net return per acre to the grower. To reach that goal, consider the following: that success in the tough years is key to business longevity. Max yield doesn't mean max returns; it's the net, not the gross, that drives business success. Pick out critical investments, make them first. Focus on return to grower value of inputs and things. Number one, clean water, nutrition, nitrogen, potassium, boron, zinc. The boron being, depending upon your location. Crop protection, timing and materials, and labor. Limited savings are possible in some of these categories. I suggest that trimming costs across the categories may be a best strategy worth considering. And finally, sharpening the blade. In any year, the most expensive inputs are the ones that don't work and aren't executed right. They're really expensive in tough years, so maintain your irrigation system with backup parts and practices in place wherever possible. Maintain and calibrate your sprayers, and train your employees to take care of the equipment and deliver the job. Thank you.
Okay, my turn now, Gabriel?
It is.
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, for most of us, it's just second nature to hit a year like this thinking in terms of what can I cut back on. And I think more useful would be to consider, okay, how do I get the most out of what I'm putting in the first place? The key, I've talked to several growers, and the theme I get is the key to low prices is high yields. And so it becomes really important, instead of cutting back on our inputs, it becomes more important to make sure that the inputs that we do put in are used effectively and efficiently. And so this means using water monitor sensors in the soil, using, I'm getting feedback here. It's confusing my talking. But, making sure you do tissue analysis, making sure that you are just monitoring everything that you do and all of your inputs. And so, especially your water, you don't want to get out of the root zone with the water. And then also an approach I take is, a professor I had once told me when he was retiring, he said, there's 3 keys to having a good life. And the first is to put family first. The second is keep your promises. And the third is anytime you have a big decision to make, run a spreadsheet. And so I've run spreadsheets on this too. And I found that the value of that's not so much in looking at the numbers as it is in what you find out by running those spreadsheets. And one thing I've found is that when we do tissue analysis or soil analysis and those sorts of things that give us good feedback, those don't cost $2 or $3 per acre. And so that's a really good return on your investment for $2 or $3 an acre. And you find that by running a spreadsheet on what your costs are and then how much you expect to yield as a result of different inputs and that sort of thing. And then finally, one grower I spoke to said that this is not a year for tax, to look for tax deductions. And so his approach was to pay off his equipment, eliminate debt, and eliminate interest expenses. And I thought, well, that's an interesting point to consider on years with low prices as well. And so I think with those, a person can do can survive these difficult times and keep going.
So,
well, good morning.
Scott.
Yeah, good morning, and thanks, Gabriel, for the introduction earlier. Also wanted to thank the Hammond board for inviting me to participate in the panel discussion. I'm hoping to put some perspective on optimizing profitability from a couple of viewpoints. One is a professional pest control advisor. Been in the business for over 35 years in the retail, crop protection, and crop nutrition industry, and also as a grower, a lifelong almond producer, currently producing today. Just like you, the producers out there, I write, sign, and send checks. So I understand what profit and loss is and what it looks like and what it can feel like. Also, I've had the opportunity through my career to be intricately involved with several large and medium and small scale almond operations. And I think one of the important components of optimizing profitability is surrounding yourself with a good team, a team of trusted advisors and experts. Those can be PCAs, cooperative extension people, irrigation specialists, CPAs, industry experts, etc. But I think it's really important to have those trusted advisors and know that they understand your business and have the best interest for you. I think having that team help you build out a plan and execute a plan gives you the best opportunity in your quest to maximize your return on investment on your operating expenditures.
Bill?
Oh, okay. Thank you, Gabriel. I take the approach, both as a grower and as a consultant, that I first focus in on things you can't change or can't cut, and then start with those and put those into your budget, or in Mike's case, put them into your spreadsheet, because these are the effects. And number one has always been water, always will be water. That's the key, not only to the life of that plant and keeping it actively growing, but maximizing production. It also is a lot of times your number one expense. One of the downsides of almonds growing has always been we're 3/4 of the way, or at least 2/3 of the way. By the time we know if we got a crop, we got our inputs already in. You have pollination expenses, you've got an irrigation system, you've got irrigation water bought or set aside. You know you're going to have to do some pest control, particularly navel orangeworm. So you're going to put those all in. So you begin to whittle down what actually can I affect. And one of those things is you can do little things. And that's the way you're going to do this. You're going to pare it off, small piece at a time. Like maybe I roll with a 3-foot strip on each side of the tree rather than a 4-foot strip. And this may increase a little bit more weeds down the center, but it's a tiny little adjustment. Calibrate the sprayers. Those are big things so that we know we're maximizing and the recommendation and putting those things out at the proper levels. And most of all, it's hang on. Also, this is not a 1-year crop. It's not a 5-year crop. We're looking at 20, at least up into maybe 30-year crop investment. So one of the things you really don't want to short is those younger trees. They're still actively growing and trying to set their roots into that growing medium. And with that in mind, you got to keep, if you're going to focus in, take care, pull back a little bit on the older orchards. The potential down the road is not as much when we get out of this little price depression, and I'm sure we will in just a few years. Also, once you get to crop set, you have a really good idea what you have there, then you can adjust your fertilizer up or down based on what you have. If we know we have a large crop and our intent is to lower fertilizer prices, our products, or how much we actually apply, but we have a large crop, you're just shorting next year's crop. And so you have to adjust and get that largest economic yield that you can at the same time, cutting in those judiciously in those spots.
Thanks. I'm going to turn first to Mike. You mentioned spreadsheets, and I know that you have looked at spreadsheets. So as you've looked at them, can you give some sense of what you see or what your observations have been for where it's worked well, where it hasn't worked well, or just in general, say some of the key expenses?
Sure. Yeah. Well, and that's what it comes down to. Actually, a spreadsheet is only as good as what you put together. And so to talk about even how to do a spreadsheet, I've listed production and harvest costs in one group, and then there's also overhead costs that we have to consider too. I mean, for the longest time, every time I heard somebody had a new product or something like that, it was going to cost $40 an acre. But that didn't include starting up that tractor, the wear and tear on it, and and paying somebody to drive that. And so you have to add that on. And talking to some growers, I've seen them say, well, geez, it's more like $100 an acre every time I do an application of any sort. And so you can plug numbers like that into included in your spreadsheet. And you want your water, you want your cost of your bees. The bees, $180 to $200 a hive, and 2 hives per acre. Maybe you get stronger hives and maybe short yourself a little on the number of hives, 1 3/4, something like that, kind of like what Bill was talking about doing. If you have 14 frame hives, you can maybe do that. Okay. And then on that spreadsheet, I also put a little grid where I said, okay, if I produce this many pounds and the price is at this amount, well, you can multiply out how much your total revenue is going to be, and then have it set up so that it subtracts out those costs that you've put in, your harvest costs, your overhead costs, your cultural costs, all of that stuff. And it can show you if you're positive or negative on the year. And yeah, I'd be happy to share the spreadsheet I have, but I think that personally, I think that the real value is in people doing their own spreadsheets. And by doing that, that's where you really discover what you start thinking. It gets you thinking about, what am I doing here? And so that's the real value of the spreadsheet to me.
A follow-up question is, have you looked at the UC extension, does cost of production estimates that gives a sense of the inputs? Do you find that useful to help think through what to think about?
Very much, because they identify all the categories. And in fact, that's where I went first when I put together my spreadsheet. Was I went to that UC publication there, and you can take that, and then you can ask yourself, okay, is this do I spend this much on say berm weed control, or do they have it broken down just very well, and it covers all different categories? So yes, I advise that completely.
Thanks. So my next question I'm addressing to fronts, and it actually relates to what Bill was talking about, and that is, one thing when you're dealing with perennial cropping systems, tree cropping systems, is you have to have a somewhat longer term vision for how you manage the orchard in this case. So my question is just sort of a reminder of about why does that matter in almonds? About if you short something this year, what's the big deal for next year? So Franz, if you could elaborate a bit on the tree physiology side of things. Yes, we can.
Okay.
At least I can.
Okay, thank you. So, all right. So flower buds start to develop the summer before they open. So growers are farming 2 crops starting in August every year. There's no restart or rewind. You've got to get it right then. And flower number per acre and relative nut set determine the yield in any year. And the research suggests that flower number is more important than yield than nut set. They're both important, the percentage nut set and the flower number, but yield's more sensitive to flower number, says the research. Most almond flowers are born on spurs. Less than 10% of the spurs set nuts 2 years in a row. So the vast majority of spurs on a tree alternate bear, but you only need about 20% of the spurs on a tree to set nuts in any 1 year to get a good crop. So the whole tree is not going to alternate bear. Spurs don't live forever, with 5 to 20% of them dying each year. And so spurs in a good light environment that's not shaded will live longer and crop regularly every other year for some time. A huge crop means more spurs carry nuts that year and will not have flowers the next year, reducing flower number per tree and yield per acre in the following year. Also, any stress in say around harvest, mites, scab, rust, anything that removes canopy or water stress is going to impact flower numbers the next year, because that's when the flowers start to form. So good irrigation and nutrition deliver balanced vegetative growth and replacement spurs to maintain good flower number and yield potential year in and year out, assuming that you can maintain the canopy strength and leaf area from year to year. That's critical. I mean, that's for an orchard that's already filled its space and you're cropping it for year 8, 9 on through. You always want, if you're immature orchard, you want to continue the growth of the tree to fill your space to give yourself the production potential.
Can you go back over some of the sort of vulnerabilities? So when you mentioned water, nutrient management, pest management around the sort of, I'll call it the whole split into harvest time frame, is that what you're talking about? Or is there, could you just give some examples of where something's gone wrong or right to help explain how you're growing not only for this year's crop, but for next year's crop?
Okay. From the pest.
You're fine.
Okay. All right. So in a current crop year, any leaf loss due to mites, rust, scab, things of that nature, reduces the number of flowers that develop, puts the tree into stress, carbohydrate stress, and reduces flower development for the next season. In a heavily cropped year, you've got more spurs carrying nuts, which means those spurs they're simply not going to be strong enough or able to carry the flowers next year, which reduces your your flower numbers, and that therefore your crop potential the next year. So those are the, I think I'm repeating myself a bit, but I hope I'm not missing your question.
So a follow-up question is, I mean, all of you in different ways in your sort of, I'll call it opening statement, emphasized focusing on the basics, water, nutrient, pest management. And I'd like each of you to expand a little bit as to why you say that. And then also providing examples again of where someone has made an error in judgment from at least your perspective. And I'm going to start this time with Bill, and then go around the panel.
Yeah, so I've worked, like I said, with growers for a lot of years. And one of the grower I remember making a statement a long time ago, he says, I don't put anything in until I know whether I got a crop or not. And I always told him, well, that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You're not going to have the crop if you wait to find out if you've got. By that time, the pollination set, it's all taken place, and now all you're doing is worrying about next year. And so it becomes, you know, a real quandary as to what it is that you can actually cut. And I've seen people in the past try to reduce their irrigation by up to, say, a foot per acre, an acre foot per acre. And the problem with that is that there's numerous research done, particularly a lot of stuff down in Kern County, which has low rainfall. And guess what? They found consistently that number that I remember was over a 10-year period. The average yield reduction was 800 pounds per acre. And that's just from moving down from around 55 inches down to about 43 inches. 1 acre foot difference. The only difference that was done in the entire 10-year study was reduction of water. So you can see water has always been, I tell growers all the time, the guy that irrigates best is usually the winner in yield. It is the number one input. It's the number one by volume. It's the number one of importance. It's the number one. Water is everything. But you have to remember, where you grow in the state makes a huge difference too. I mean, if I'm in Bakersfield, I'm expecting 3, and in a real bumper, you're maybe 6 inches of rain. Is all I'm going to get in Kern County. If I get up into up near, you know, Colusa County, Butte County, up in that, I'm expecting at least 18 inches, maybe up to 24 inches, and sometimes even more. But at the end of the day, you still need approximately 55 to 60 inches to grow a crop of almonds. So if you're in you know, Butte County, you might only use 2.5 to 3 acre feet based on the amount of rainfall and when it fell. You get down into Kern County, you better be planning on using at least somewhere in the neighborhood of 50 inches minimum, and maybe upwards of 55. So those things, I keep coming back to irrigation. I know I'm a fertility consultant. We talk a lot about nutrients and how to build nutrients. You don't get the water right, you're not going to have the crop that you ever wanted to have out of your almond field. Same thing is, what kind of soil do I have? Do I have a light sandy soil? I'm going to farm that way different than if I've got a fairly heavy clay. I can't squeeze down much on fertility on a light sandy soil because it does not have the nutrient holding capacity that it would have in a heavier clay. So I could short it a little bit and work off the bank in a heavy clay type situation, or even a moderate clay. But when I get to a sand, there is no buffering capacity. There is no holding capacity, either for water or nutrients. There's some great things about sand. Nutrient holding and water holding are not two of them. And so that's why you have to come back and know your soil. And I'll go back to what Scott said, to know somebody that you can trust, that can help you, let's work through these things more. We have a lot of young almond growers. There's a lot of people who've been around a lot of years, but there's a lot of young almond growers, and they're new to this business. And they're watching neighbors, they're listening to advisors. Find one that's been through the wars, been through low prices before. You know, I've been there. I've been growing almonds for more than 40 years. And a lot of my stuff's on second generation, and I don't do nearly what I did when I started. We used to think 2,000 pounds the acre was the end all of crops. Well, that's not going to keep you in this game these days. We need to be looking at that. And if you look at over the years, the almond board's numbers will tell you that the crop production per acre has went up and is steadily going up. If you get down into the southern end of the valley, you'll notice that when you're paying high prices for water to irrigate this crop, you better have large crops, and you hope that prices can at least stay above $2 and more towards like $2.50 to be able to be a reasonable return on your investment.
Scott, what would you like to add to that?
Well, I agree with everything Bill says. I'll kind of maybe take a look at it from a pest management perspective. Some things to think about when you're choosing chemistries for various pest control measures. I always like to kind of use the cost per day of control. And if you think of it in those terms, sometimes some of your more expensive chemistries may appear to be more costly, but they have a lot longer residual. So your actual cost per day of control actually can be similar or sometimes less than a less expensive chemistry. It's easy to, very easy to be attracted to a lower cost product, but sometimes that maybe isn't the most economical approach on a certain pest. I think another thing important from a pest control side is timing. Having your timing right can help you reduce cost. Smaller weeds are easier to kill. Early harvest helps reduce NOW damage. That early harvest and timing, that doesn't cost you anything. So being in front of your timing can certainly help you reduce costs. I think another really important thing to think about is maximizing your quality, because quality pays premiums. And so getting in your quality where you can get into an in-shell program with your nonpareils and your independents and sonoras can drastically improve your overall payments per pound. So again, I think from a pest management side, really the take-home messages would be choose your chemistries that give you the best economic control, thinking of that cost per day of control, and get your timing right. I think those are a couple things to put in your plans going forward.
Mike, again, anything to add to that?
Well, there's not a whole lot to add to that, but it's excellent advice, especially the early, like Scott says, the early harvesting doesn't cost you a thing, but it can sure make you some money in your returns if you have low navel orangeworm. I think the whole industry has seen Mel Machado's presentation and spreadsheet where low navel orangeworm or low reject levels in general lead to drastic differences in your in how much you're making per acre. And on years like we're looking at these days, that's critical. You've got to get it all. Bill's talks about the sand versus clay and all of those things. I always tell growers that almond growing is really pretty simple when you look at it. It's really you just sunlight, water, and nutrition. Because with almonds, the more wood you grow, the more nuts you get. And Franz pointed out the spurs. Yeah, you need the spurs, but generally, the more growth you have on that tree, the better yields you get. And we worry about shading sometimes, but I've seen trees that are like 30, 40 feet tall, and I can't even see the crop. And they turn out they've got 2,800 pounds up on the top of that tree. because there's a big producing area up there that's getting the sunlight. So it really comes down to, sunlight, water, and nutrition. And then for us, the water and nutrition is our part of it. And so the key is to make sure that what we apply gets used by the tree, and that's in that root zone. And so as long as we are monitoring, and we know that we're not flushing our nitrogen or other nutrients down below the root zone, but irrigating just right. Drip irrigation is a wonderful tool that's come along, and we can use that to manage where the nutrition is in the root zone to feed those trees to grow that wood, make those spurs, and make those nuts. So it's really not that complicated. So.
And fronts, I mean, again, you already mentioned at the beginning that really focusing on these key items. I mean, can you give some examples maybe of where something's gone awry to add to the mix as to why all of you are focusing on the key areas of water, nutrients, and pest management?
Good question. Usually I think about somebody deciding because money is tight to ignore a certain input. Maybe you skip potassium this year. It's expensive, $200 an acre, ballpark for dried SOP at 500 pounds an acre. If you have a big crop, you may be deficient in potassium, and that's going to impact your spur health and return bloom the next year. Maybe instead of the research suggests that depending upon your location, if you have some potassium already in the soil, you may be able to get by with half of that. So you haven't walked away from the practice, but you put on enough to maintain the potential for next year. That sort of thing. If that's that comes to my mind. I hope I'm getting at what you're after. Or skipping a spring fungicide because you've got fungicide fatigue setting in, especially up our way where a wet spring will bring in a number of rain events.
Right. Scott, you mentioned finding trustworthy consultants or a community. How do you do that? Or what are the traits you're looking for?
Well, I would probably, if I put myself in a grower's shoes, or in my grower's shoes, I would look around and look at fellow growers, producers, and if there's some producers out there that you admire, you feel like they're on top of things, they know what they're doing, I'd ask them, for referrals. There's a lot of great people out there, consultants, experts. But I think if somebody's looking for one, they just need to ask. And I think a fellow producer is the first place to start.
Okay. And I'm not going to flip it. I mean, whether I look at, we have the conference, there's a number of booths, so there's a lot of people wanting to sell things to almond growers. I'll just be upfront here. And we also know, as you mentioned, I think, Bill, you really articulated this clearly, really thinking through what are there investments that have long-term benefits. And so I really am trying to figure out, as a grower, where you're trying to figure out, is it worth investing in, something that improves my irrigation efficiency, even though the costs are now, I may not see the benefits for, or the benefits may be amortized over several years, or, there's a lot of push to do soil health practices that often have some upfront costs, or, there's a number of materials out there which may or may not have research behind it in terms of what they do or don't do. I mean, how do you help growers think through, when is it worthwhile to invest in something that has a long-term benefit, even though it may not accrue right away in times like this?
Yeah, Gabriel.
I'm opening up to any of you to take a stab at that.
Okay, am I on, Gabriel? This is Bill.
You
Can
are.
you hear me? Okay.
Yes.
Well, one of the things you got to get away from is cost and look at benefit. And I know when people look at it, that you don't put on the spray because it's $50 an acre or $100 an acre. You put it on for the effect it gives you. And that effect has been proven over time and time as to how much by not doing it will it hurt me, or how much am I giving up because I don't do a practice. If you can look at it and you can get certain years, and if you do things like soil building and soil health when times are good, it's easier now to skate down the road a little bit and not do quite the effect. But if that crop removed would take a number 300 to 500 pounds of actual K from the soil, well, where's it going to come from next year, and the next year, and the next year? Once you've shorted it, you've hurt yourself going forward. Now, can you squeeze it a little bit? Yeah. If you go from 500 to 400 pounds, yeah, you may be able to make that work. The other thing I see people doing, I always encourage them, it's just like an analogy I use is raising kids. You can't just throw them out there and pick them up when they're 15 years old. And that would be like a 4-year-old almond orchard, but pick them up when they're 15 years old and then try to shape them into what you want them to be. You've got that lot of investment getting it into the ground and up to a level where it's going to be productive. You've got to take care of that. You got to make your investment in that, whether in your kids, it's in their education, in this orchard, it's in its long-term viability, which comes from proper nutrition, proper irrigation, and proper pest control. There are several places, and so I'm kind of going backwards. Take care of your young stuff. It's going to have the most longevity, and the things you do are going to hurt it and are going to affect you the longest. You've got an orchard that's out there at 24, 25 years old, and you're thinking you have maybe 3 years left. Oh, maybe that's the one I'm going to take and squeeze back a little bit. It's kind of like people my age. You get a lot tougher when you get older. And so you're going to endure a lot of problems that maybe you couldn't when you were a teenager in your 20s. You've toughened the skin, so to speak. And those old trees have a broader area from which to draw nutrients from. So they can maybe squeeze through in a tough year. But the long-term solution is not going to be what you cut, it's how much you make. And I always, as a consultant, derive no income from the sale of any product. One of the advantages to that particular situation is that when I'm telling them to do something, it's with my training, education, and experience. I know that that's what they need to do. We'll pare the budget a little bit here or there, but I always tell them, let me do the paring. I'll be the one that cuts those from your budget. And then when the crop shows that it's a huge crop, then we have to adjust, and we're going to have justification for those. But the long-term thing is get away from cost and look at benefit. The easiest thing to do, if you want to look at it this way, is don't put on any water, don't put on any pest control, and don't put on any nutrition, and you'll have the lowest cost of anybody. You'll also have the lowest crop, and you're not going to survive this thing. So you have to spend to get something back. And long term, you have to have longevity of that orchard. It's a huge expense to tear one out, put it back in, and get it up to now where you're going to reap benefits. And then to abandon that right at that point is just not going to work.
Others?
Saying about bringing them up young, it reminds me of a grower one time that was pulling out an old orchard and said, oh, well, this is my last year I'm going to have this orchard. I'm going to just milk it and get the crop and not add anything to it. And his neighbor pointed out to him, wait a minute, are you planning on replanting that orchard? He said, so are you going to milk all the nutrients out of that soil and then plant a young orchard into that? So even raising up those babies comes into play even before you even plant them. You have to be thinking ahead like that. And that really plays into, we have to have long-term thinking in all these decisions that we make because these trees are not just year after, it's not a corn crop. It's a long-term crop that we have to continue investing in year after year.
Scott?
Yeah, well, one other, Gabriel, you mentioned maybe some experiences when things didn't go right. And one that comes to mind is I even saw a little bit of it in this past season, is dry springs typically lead to less fungicide applications. But as a result of that, especially the way we manage our water with drip and micros now, I've seen some of the worst scab and rust years develop after a dry spring, because we create that environment through our irrigation practices that are conducive to scab and rust alternaria, but with a lack of fungicide applications from the traditional spring rain approach, we can run into problems and have major leaf loss during the summertime.
So, Franz, just coming back to the question, I mean, since you also, forgot to say at the beginning, you also are managing a ranch, Nichols, forget the full name, but Nichols. So you're not just advising, you actually have to make decisions like a grower. As you're thinking about, trying to make that decision between investment in equipment, in technology, in nutrition, or something that again has a longer term benefit but has costs right now, how do you weigh? You heard, Bill was really focusing on look at the benefits you're getting. So how do you think about that?
That's a good question, as Bill suggested, you start with clean water, and the point again that Bill's made and several other folks have made, that successful growers are profit maximizers, not cost minimizers. As my old buddy in the Ag Econ used to tell me. I think I'm looking for ways to I'm not sure how I'm going to work it all out, but I know as several of the speakers have pointed out, Scott and Bill, Mike, you can't skip some things, otherwise you won't be, you won't have a marketable crop in the long run. And I have to sit down with a spreadsheet and figure out just what needs to go on in an average year, and where the economics are going to come together to make sure that happens. So I'm being really vague, but it's a challenge. But I may have to reach out beyond what the farm credit or some other source of funds to sustain us, to make sure we do the right things so we have a crop to harvest in 22 and beyond as the correction price improvement situation comes around. So I don't have a clear path at the moment, but it's not going to be cutting to the bare bone and crossing our fingers.
So I'm going to ask a final question, and this is based on what I've been hearing here. So we had a generally bumper crop this past growing season. It hasn't rained. As you're looking at what growers should be thinking about for this coming year, going into this year where water seems to be again highly uncertain, and we just had a bumper crop. Is anything to think about there? And yeah, again, I'll start with Scott and go up the images.
Well, the fact that we're so dry up to this point, fairly soon we're going to have to start making decisions whether we need to pre-irrigate or not. And I think that decision has to be made, excuse me, fairly soon after the first of the year, before the roots become to get active. So if we're going to have to start irrigating and fill up these profiles back up, I think that's going to be a thought process people are going to have to start thinking about, because that's coming up here fairly quickly. And the last thing you want to be doing is just trying to fill that profile up when the roots start to become active and could cause some damage to the root system.
Mike?
That was where I was headed as well. That what I find is the pre-irrigation or a good wet winter, either one you get, either whichever one you can use or get, does wonders for when we hit those real hot spells in August. And so, yeah, getting water down into that deep profile is critical. And you don't even get to see the benefit of that until August, late July, August. And and if the trees, like this year, I noticed the trees, even though they were loaded, they stayed green well into the beginning of harvest. And then, you know, we had some heat spells there, and then finally the mites hit. But early in this last year, we were thinking, oh man, the mites aren't bad this year. And I think a big part of that is that deep water profile. When the trees are healthy and green going into harvest, then we have less of a issue of mites. And so if a person can pre-irrigate now, like Scott says, it's a tough decision, because sure enough, we'll pre-irrigate and spend the money on the water and the energy to pump the water if we have to down here in the South. And sure enough, you know, February, March, and April will just deluge us, and it'll be wasted. But still, filling that deep profile is critical. And then I also hope that the folks, I'm sure most of the growers that had these bumper crops understood that and adjusted their nutrition, adjusted their nitrogen and potash and all of that this year to account for that, because that'll show up in next year's crop.
Bill?
Yeah, I had early in my consulting career, I had a grower, and I still remember it to this day. He's still a client of mine, long-term friend and grower. He told me when I came in one time and I put a fertility program together for him, and I showed him all of where I was going to cut costs, and here we're going to, because the potash was one of the highest years it's ever been, and different forms of nitrogen. We're going to do this and this to it. And he looked me straight in the eye and he says, "Do you know why I hired you?" And I kind of had loss of words, and he says, "To make me money, not save me money." And this crop is such that you can cut. There are places, some here, some there. But if you don't put in your basic program and maintain these, you're going to pay for it for years down the road. Now, having said that, if you go down to, I'm fortunate, I get to see a lot of country. I see it from about as far north as they grow almonds to about as far south, and everything in between. One of the things you notice is you can't farm in Butte County the same way you farm in Kern County, and vice versa. You go to Kern County, they're used to putting water on all winter long because they don't expect rainwater. So it's not unusual for them to keep their soil profiles up. And incidentally, it also is a place they don't get any rain. They consistently are near the top of the highest producing orchards because they control the environment. They control the water, and they control the rainfall. They don't control it, but they don't have to worry as much about going to. I've been in Chico where it's over 30 inches and it's wet everywhere, and it doesn't dry up, and it's hard to get fertility out. It's hard to get any pollination, and fungicides are difficult to apply. But yet we'll survive because that's where you grow and that's what you're accustomed to doing. So you know how to get by. But we don't have control over water, rainfall. What we have control is inputs and timing. And so I always focus back. It's timing, timing, timing. I always tell people, you need to put on for this crop, the size based on Patrick Brown's nitrogen recommendations, you need 240 pounds of nitrogen to be applied. Well, if I go out there in May and put 240 pounds all at one time, doesn't do me much good. It doesn't supply the crop when it needs it, and there's a lot of it's going to be wasted. But I put on the proper units. Timing. When does that crop start to pick up nutrients? When is the best time to place it? Post-harvest, you have a tremendous opportunity for post-harvest to get in an active root situation. After it's harvested, we get a tremendous root flush. It's teaching growers how to get the most out of what you're spending. If you have the wrong soil chemistry in your soil, you may only be 50% effective on your nitrogen uptake. But if you got things balanced, you might be upwards of 80 to 90% with timing, units applied. Gets back to what the FREP has been telling us about the 4 R's. So important, you know, the right amount at the right time in the right place. And if you follow those, you then can begin to squeeze out what you do with nitrogen and maybe potash. But if you're not doing things right going into it, it's difficult because you don't have the efficiencies. So the main thing, and I go back to what Scott is, there's a lot of good people out here with good recommendations, and you got to get someone, because that's what they normally, like me, I spend most of my time reading. I haven't read a novel in I don't know how long, but I can guarantee I've read a lot of fertility articles and journals and books and everything, because that's what I'm most interested in. That's what I do. Find somebody that's got that passion, because you have the passion to run your farm and farm it. And because of that, you know, you spend most of your time on running that farm and maximizing it. And you know your ground better than any PCA does, because you irrigate it yourself and been on it. So use those people for these little pieces that we can, I think we can do this year and get by here. But, you know, if that's a very valuable crop, well, you don't want to take the risk. If it's not as valuable, you might take a little bit more risk. But ultimately, the piper has to be paid. You have to take care of navel lungworm, you have to take care of fungal diseases, and you have to take care of the general fertility. And it's tough to say that in an off year. So, but that's what you have to do.
And Frantz, any closing wisdom?
Not to follow these gentlemen. So no, thank you. Profit maximizing, not cost minimizing. We'll see what the crop looks like up north, and we'll feed and protect it as we go. But no, thanks. That's what I've got.
Okay. Well, I want to thank all 4 of you for taking the time and also learning the technology for this live session. I hope for the audience it was useful. As I have to admit, you keep hoping to hear the silver bullet. And what I'm hearing is you really need to focus on the basics, what we know works, and really make sure you know how to do it well for your particular situation. So with that, thank you. I can't remember what's next after this session, but we have 2 more days of conference, and you also have the trade show floor that's virtual. So please take the time to visit it. And if you're interested in our research program, we have the research updates. It's available in one of the, you can find it in one of the tabs inside from the lobby. So thank you, everybody.